Welcome back to Exploring the Old Testament. I'm Dr. Hutchins, and today we want to talk about the book of Exodus. Now, when I started talking about the book of Genesis, I talked about how foundational it is to the entire Bible. If you had to pick one book that was only second in terms of its influence over the rest of the Bible, it probably would either be Exodus or the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, we could, of course, say that the entire law, the first 5 books of Moses, what sometimes we refer to as the Torah, which is the Hebrew word for law or instruction, we could say those 5 books are absolutely foundational for all of the Old Testament and the Bible as well. In fact, all the other sections of the Old Testament are, in one sense or another, simply commentary and reflection on the 5 books of Moses, because it's in those 5 books that God forms his people, the nation of Israel. He makes a covenant with them and gives them the expectations or obligations that they're to have in that covenant. And therefore, the rest of their history is simply their attempts and failures to fulfill their end of the covenant, and how God then is going to respond with both judgment and mercy to his people's failings. So all that comes back to Genesis and, of course, Exodus. Exodus also written by Moses, written to the nation of Israel, so that they could have this record of these important events where God used Moses himself to bring his people out of the land of Egypt, and written during that period after they had left Egypt, but before they enter the promised land, probably 1450 to 1410 BC. And in this book, the focus is primarily on Moses and the act of deliverance. So the main idea of the entire book is that God delivered Israel from Egypt and made them his people. He delivered Israel from Egypt, and then based on their salvation, he adopts them and makes them his own people. Now, again, the book of Exodus can be split into 2 parts, roughly corresponding to those 2 sections of the main idea I just mentioned. So in chapters 1 to 18, God is delivering Israel from Egypt. And then in chapters 19 to 40, we see how God makes a covenant with the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. And it is in that act of making a covenant with the people that they are officially, formally being recognized as God's own people. So God delivered Israel from Egypt. He makes them his people. Chapters 1 to 18, God delivers Israel from Egypt. That part of the story begins with how God first delivers Moses. First, he has to save the Savior in order to make him the deliverer. And of course, we'll talk a little more about how God did that in a moment. Chapters 5 to 15, God defeats Egypt and frees Israel. And of course, that's where we get all the stories of the famous plagues that God sends upon Egypt. And then chapters 15 to 18 is Israel's journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai. And then once they get to Mount Sinai, that's where we get to that second half of the book, where God is making a covenant with the nation of Israel and adopting them formally as his children, as his people. So in 19 to 24, God establishes the covenant. In 25 to 31, God gives instructions for the tabernacle, which is essential to this covenant relationship that they're going to have. And chapters 32 to 34, we see the failure of Israel already. Israel's going to forsake God, but Moses is going to intercede for them so that God has mercy upon them. And then in chapters 35 to 40, we get the actual building of the tabernacle. So we start, the big events that we see in this book starts with the story of Moses himself and how Moses is chosen, set apart, and actually himself delivered in order to save the nation of Israel from Egypt. So Moses himself escapes the judgment of Pharaoh when Pharaoh decides to kill all the boys that are born to the nation of Israel in order to stamp down on their population, which he sees as a threat. Moses escapes that destruction when he is placed in a basket or an ark and put into the Nile River. And of course, this is an act that's looking backwards and forwards. It's looking backwards to the other ark, the ark that God used to save Noah from judgment. But it's also looking forwards to the next time we're going to see salvation through water, which is the crossing of the Red Sea. And in this instance, he is saved by this unlikely figure. Pharaoh's own daughter is the one who draws him out of the water, gives him the name Moses because he has been drawn out of the water. Pharaoh's daughter raises Moses as a son of Pharaoh in Pharaoh's household, although he does spend a significant time of his life with his Hebrew mother, who is the one that's hired to nurse him, but then he is identified as an Egyptian. And yet he has this identity with the Hebrew people so that when he sees the Egyptian slave drivers abusing Hebrew slaves, he attacks one and actually kills one so that he must now again escape from Pharaoh. He runs off into the deserts and finds himself in the land of Midian, where he becomes a shepherd and seeks refuge there. He spends 40 years as a son of Pharaoh. Then he escapes after killing the Egyptian and spends 40 years in the land of Midian. And that is when God comes to him again and speaks now directly to Moses at a burning bush and will command him to return to Egypt, this time as the one God is going to use to deliver the nation of Israel. Now, it's in that event we get one very important idea from the Bible, and that is the idea that God is I am. I am. That's actually God's identity, his name. So at the burning bush, Moses asks God, when I go back to the Hebrews and I tell them that God has sent me, they're going to ask me, which God? They've been living in Egypt and they understand the Egyptians believe in many gods. There's the god Ra and there's all these other gods. The Nile River itself is seen as divine, as a god. So Moses, which God are you talking about? Because there are many gods. And God says, tell them, I am who I am has sent you. So God identifies himself. He gives his personal name as that phrase, I am who I am. And in fact, it's from those words, I am, that we get God's personal name in the Old Testament. In our English translations, like the English Standard Version that I have here, or the New International Version, the King James Version, the Christian Standard Bible, in those translations, we see that name quite clearly whenever we come to the word Lord, but instead of typically being capital L, lowercase o-r-d, in these instances, it is capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. When you see the name Lord capitalized all the way across, that's indicating that it is the personal, divine name of God himself in the Hebrew Bible at that point. So when we see that, we know it is the name Yahweh. Older scholars thought that it should be pronounced Jehovah. It is now been rejected that was the proper way to pronounce that. But sometimes maybe you'll hear in a song or some older book or someone speaking, they'll talk about Jehovah. That's the same thing. But today, most scholars will say it should be pronounced Yahweh or Yahweh. And that name is coming from that phrase, I am who I am. That God is identifying himself not as a God like, some of the Greek gods you might be familiar with, Zeus or Hermes, someone who just has a certain name among other gods who has names, but a God that is quite unique because he simply is who he is. It's a name that communicates very important truths about God. The first thing that it teaches us about God is that God is independent. He is who he is. He does not need us. He does not need anything. God does not depend on us to do anything for him, for his survival. He is not dependent on food. He's not dependent on oxygen. He's not dependent on anything outside of himself. He simply is. He is who he is. It also teaches us that God is unchangeable, that he's not who he was, he's not who he will be, he simply is who he is. And he will always be who he is. He's unchangeable. And as someone who's unchangeable, he will always be loyal and perfect to his promises, to his covenants. That's going to be foundational to the later part of the book where God makes a covenant with the nation of Israel, and he tells them, I am the Lord, Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And so when he's making a promise to them, it's absolutely solid and unchanging because he himself is solid and unchanging. He will never change. It also communicates that he is eternal and timeless. He's outside of time. He simply is. He is existence himself. We are someone that we're becoming, we're someone that we were, but God simply always is. There is no other God like him. He alone is I am who I am. And therefore, the God that is speaking to Moses, the God that's going to deliver Israel from Egypt, is a God that is unlike any other God that was being worshipped by the Egyptians or the Canaanites or any peoples in that time period all the way up to today. And that's important because next Moses obeys God, he goes back to Egypt, right? And that's when we see that God saves Israel and he judges Egypt. And the primary acts of that judgment, of course, you have all the plagues, but the worst of the plagues is on the night of the Passover. And then we get kind of the encore act as they cross the Red Sea. So Exodus 11 through 12 is really that climax when God sends that final plague. And that final plague is to kill the firstborn sons of Egypt. Now, all the other plagues are important, but they're kind of leading up to this final plague. All the other plagues should be seen as God actually doing battle with the gods of Egypt. So you think about it, Egypt had all these different gods who were in charge of all different aspects of life. So they worship the sun god, Ra. What does God do? He brings darkness on the land. They worship the Nile River as a god because it floods annually and gives fertility to their land. He turns it to blood. So, all of these different plagues are being identified with one or more of the Egyptian gods and seen as the God of Israel, Yahweh, showing that he is superior to the Egyptian gods. And of course, the last plague targets who? It targets Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh is the embodiment of God. He is God on earth. who is ruling over his people. And the spirit that is in Pharaoh is then passed down to each son that would replace him and be the heir to the throne, so that the God is constantly incarnated in Pharaoh ruling over the Egyptian people. So God sends the angel of death into Egypt, and what happens? The firstborn son of Pharaoh, the next Pharaoh, is killed. Pharaoh himself, his own household, is attacked, along with the households of all those in Egypt. And the Israelites, too, would not have escaped this, except for the fact that God gave them a way of salvation. He told them that on that night they were to take a lamb, a lamb without blemish, kill it, and paint the blood of that lamb around the doorposts of their home, so that when the angel of death would come, he would see the blood and he would what? Pass over those households. And so we call that festival, where they remember this day of salvation every year, the Passover, the festival of Passover, because it was on that night that the angel of death passed over the households of the Egyptians and did not kill their firstborn. But when Pharaoh realizes what has happened, finally he caves in. He releases the Israelites. And the Israelites, they already are packed. They already have their clothes on, their shoes on, their staff in their hand. They take off. And yet God does not lead them directly on the interstate highway to the land that he's chosen for them. Instead, God leads them to the Red Sea. And as they're approaching the Red Sea, suddenly Pharaoh, what? He changes his mind. He decides he's made a mistake. He sends out the army, and now, once again, the Hebrews are in an impossible situation. They're trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. And so they can't get across, they can't wade across, they can't swim across, they have no boats. They can't go back and fight the most powerful army in the world, of the world's greatest superpower of their day. They're trapped. And so Moses calls out to God. God tells Moses to hold his staff over the Red Sea. A wind blows all night long, and the next morning there is dry land that the Israelites can cross on. They cross across the sea, and then Pharaoh's army pursues them, and then the waves crash down upon Pharaoh's army and destroys his army. And so once again, we see God judging the Egyptians, but saving the Israelites. And in this act, God is showing that he has identified this people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as his very own people. He has taken on their cause as his own cause. And he has done for them something that they could never do for themselves. So after this, he leads them through the Sinai wilderness to the foot of Mount Sinai. And it is there that God chooses Israel and gives Israel his law and establishes this covenant relationship with Israel. One important passage that really shows some of the important themes about this is Exodus chapter 19, verses 4-6. This is what it says. You have seen, this is God speaking to the nation, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine, and you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. These are the words that you are to say to the Israelites. So God is saying, I own the entire world. I own all the nations of the world. And yet I have chosen you, Israel, for my special mission, my special task. And so one of the roles you're going to have is I'm going to give you my law, and you're to keep that law, because as my people, you're to reflect my holy character. You're actually going to be to me a treasured possession. You're going to be to me a kingdom of priests, so that people are going to look at you and they're going to see in this nation a people who has a direct relationship with God himself. And of course, we'll talk more about all the laws that are coming. There's laws in Exodus, there's laws in Leviticus, and even some in Numbers, and especially in Deuteronomy. But what we're going to see is that God has established these people to be his own people. And the law, its primary role is to teach them how to be who God has isolated them to be, how to be the people that God has identified them to be. He says, you're my people, you're my kingdom of priests. Now, this is how you do it. This is how you're to love me and love others and be identified as my own people. And yet, even in the book of Exodus already, we're going to see that the people are going to fail to do that. They're going to fail to uphold the 10 Commandments, which are in Exodus chapter 20. They're going to fail to uphold all the other commands as well, but especially the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments give us 10 commands, obviously, but they really fall into two categories that reflect the two greatest commands as Jesus identifies them. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So what are the first commands? You shall have no other God before me. You shall not make a false image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in name. You shall remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Those are all commands that are focused on who God is and how we are to love God. And then the other commands are how we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. Honor your father and mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not lie. You shall not steal. You shall not covet what belongs to your neighbor. So all of these are teaching us, how are we to be the people God has called us to be? And yet, immediately after receiving those commands, actually after hearing it in a voice like thunder from God himself, the very next thing we read is that Israel violates the very first two commands. They do not keep God alone as their God, and they make for themselves an image, an idol that they worship. God delivered Israel. He chose them. He gave them the law. But when Moses is on Mount Sinai and they start to think, what's happened to him? They ask Moses' brother Aaron to fashion a god for them. They give him all this gold that they had taken from the Egyptians, and they say, make a god for us, the God that took us out of Egypt. And so he forms an idol that looks like a golden calf. And of course, all of this is foreshadowing what's going to happen again and again and again throughout Israelite history. Israel has been chosen as God's own people, has been dedicated to him, and yet time and again, that is not enough for them. They will pursue idols again and again and again until eventually God is going to bring the final judgment upon the nation of taking them into exile, taking them out of the promised land so that they will be judged. Now, in the midst of all of this, there's one very interesting passage in Exodus chapter 33 and 34. In Exodus 33:18, Moses makes a request from God. He asks God to show him his glory. Now, God says, I can't show you my glory. You can't see me face to face or you'll die. But what I'll do is I'll put you in this cleft of a rock, in this crack. I'll cover you with my hand, and you can't see my face, but you can see the afterglow after I've passed. You can't see me directly. So that's what Moses is told is going to happen. But when it actually happens in Exodus 34, Moses doesn't really describe the light or what he saw. He describes what he heard. And what he heard was a declaration of the Lord's self-identity to Moses. God passed by and he says, the Lord, that divine name again, Yahweh, Yahweh is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. So God's glory is not really the light of his presence or even the glory cloud that was sometimes seen in the Old Testament. God's glory is really the great beauty of God's own character, the great beauty of who God is as he reveals himself in history as creator, as judge, and as savior. And so that's what God reveals to Moses here. He reveals that he is a righteous God, he is just, he will punish sin, and yet he is also a God of love and mercy, a God who lovingly gives himself away to others and forgives sinners. This is an idea that is going to be reflected and repeated throughout the Bible, that God is both of these things, a God of justice and a God of grace and mercy. And in fact, you can't have a God of grace and mercy without God being a God of justice. It's absolutely essential. If God is going to be a holy and righteous God who yet can forgive us and take us to himself, he still has to be a God of justice. It's not a popular idea today. People want a God that just will look the other way, a God who will accept everyone no matter what, a God who will send no one to hell except maybe Hitler and Stalin and Vladimir Putin. But if we believe in a God of mercy and grace, we have to have a God of justice, a God who really is good because he punishes sin, but a God who also is going to find a way that's going to cost him everything by sending his own son to satisfy the price of justice in order to show mercy to his people so that he can dwell with us. And that's where the book of Exodus ends. We have another video that focuses entirely on this, so I won't talk much about it. But the book of Exodus ends with God's plan and the actual execution of the plan of making the tabernacle. That what is unique about the people of Israel is that God is going to dwell in their very midst. Now, where do we see Jesus in this book? The book of Exodus is the salvation act of the Old Testament. When you would ask an ancient Israelite, what is salvation? They would have probably said salvation was when God saved our people from Egypt. And yet this salvation was just a picture, a shadow of a greater salvation that was to come. In fact, in the book of Exodus itself, we've seen that even though God saved Israel from their physical slavery to Egypt, there was still a problem with the nation of Israel. They were still enslaved to their sin. That's why they make that golden calf. That's why they seek something else other than God, because sin is still in their heart. The problem that Adam had is still there. And so they don't need just a physical salvation in a similar way that Noah's physical salvation did not deal with the problem of sin. They're going to need what the Bible and the prophets and the New Testament are going to refer to as a second Exodus. Another greater Exodus that is not only going to save the people physically, but actually bring their hearts to God completely. Defeat the problem of sin, bring forgiveness and transformation to God's people. And that has happened through Jesus Christ. Jesus is the new and greater Moses who came not only to give us a physical salvation, no, to give us so much more. To give us salvation from sin, from Satan, from death that we deserve, from hell that we deserve forever because of our sin. Jesus does that by giving his self on the cross. And that way he makes a way by becoming the Passover lamb for us. The death passes over us and he makes a way for us to dwell with God. How? Not through a physical tabernacle, but through himself. He himself becomes the tabernacle where we will dwell with God through our faith in Jesus Christ.